Hello and welcome to Outlook Discussions. This week we have put together a cover story, a cover package on the concept of federalism. What our forefathers fought for, what they envisioned, what our constitution enshrined about federalism, and what it has come to be today. There are various questions related to this. For instance, is India a nation or a unity of states? Where does the center-state balance lie? Do opposition-ruled states get a raw deal from the center when it comes to finances and schemes? To discuss this, we have with us Professor Tanveer Ejaz from Delhi University. He is also a director with the Center for Multi-Level Federalism. And we of course have Chinky Sinha, our editor, Outlook editor. Chinky, if I may begin with you in the sense that when we were discussing this whole concept and what we set out to do, if you would like to briefly explain what the issue has.
Okay, so we were looking at federalism for a long time actually, ever since we joined. Yeah. And we were looking for a right moment to come out with this cover package. And I thought the elections were very interesting because I was in Goa and I figured that Goa identity politics was very different now in terms of revolutionary Goans, and they were talking about Goan interests. So somehow that kind of related with the federalism issue. Then we had Manipur obviously, and then we had gone Nagaland, and that whole northeast situation was different. And then we had Punjab, and we have UP, and we have Uttarakhand. So Uttarakhand again has different kinds of laws. So these elections were very interesting also because of the fact that Mamata Banerjee was taking a leap from here to Goa, and then AAP was taking a claim in Goa. And when I went to Goa, all I could see was Mamata Banerjee, sometimes like 5 posters together. And actually BJP was very conspicuous in terms of absence. They were like these small posters or whatever. So we thought that this is the right moment to talk about federalism. Also, over the last 2-3 years, we have seen various state governments actually kind of, like when we see Maharashtra and COVID, I mean, with a very hostile central government, Maharashtra was kind of, and then we also saw Bihar, we saw other states. Bihar did not let the migrants in when Modi said that now the state governments have. So, that question was always there as to what these state governments are and how they hold on to their own. With the current elections, we wanted to engage and kind of explore that question, that whether federalism will protect in terms of coalition politics, the regional parties, the state parties, whether it will form the core of federalism, which a lot of people say that we are losing. So we have Tanveer who kind of like actually helped me a lot because the whole discussion started with him, and the first person I called was him because nobody else understood the brief except me.
In fact, this point what we were discussing about the smaller parties asserting themselves, some of them actually going beyond the borders, like say AAP going to Goa, Punjab, TMC going to Goa, etc. Would you say that something like this actually augurs well for the the idea of federalism, the regional parties getting stronger?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we can see it from both the perspective, as I was discussing with you. It has both positive as well as the negative aspect both. It all depends that in which way the state parties take up their aspirations and negotiate with the center. For instance, I was just talking about that, if center makes a farm law without consulting state governments, without consulting the chief ministers, but there are certain chief ministers who will go along with the center, even if the center is bypassing. So in that sense, the regional party would not be doing well if some of these states' autonomy is being violated by the center. So state parties, regional parties, they have to be very clear about the fact that there is a self-rule by the state governments, and they have their own list in the constitution, which is called the state list, because federalism is a political administrative structure in the constitution. It's a framework within which the constitution has to operate, and the politics has to operate. The whole political process, federal process, cannot go beyond the constitutional structure. And as you know, that federalism is one of the basic structure of the constitution, as it has been said in the Bombay case, right? So it depends, but it's the advantage of regional parties coming up with the state's aspirations, because they are, India is a very diverse country. You know that, it's a multilingual, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. So it's a very diverse country. And diversity perhaps is reflected in the states, because we know that the State Reorganization Act was done on the linguistic basis, and language is one of the vehicle of culture. So that way the states do represent certain regional aspirations, and those regional aspirations emerges out in the regional parties.
In fact, it's a kind of an inbuilt thing, isn't it? A state party is sort of means that it's going to represent the state's interest, sort of. Which is not said is against the center.
Right. So how a state represents, there are two levels at which a state cross currents with the center, and that is, one is that they have to share the sovereignty, share the powers, which is again given in the constitution. So there is the sharing of the policy, sharing of the governance, sharing of the, let's say, certain structural powers they have to share. Also at the same time, there's this idea of self-rule. They are autonomous in their own way, right? Now, the sharing of power has to be seen in terms of how much accommodation is there, how much consensus is there. What we are seeing right now, going by certain legislations which have been done by the center, this is a top-down thrust, right? And in fact, because India is a very unique federal nation, right? It's a very unique in a sense that lots of political scientists and constitutional experts, they have called it as centralized federation or quasi-federation, right? So it's not federal in a sense like USA or Switzerland or Canada. So in that sense, there is some extraordinary power given to the central legislature or a central parliament, right? Some extraordinary powers are there, but it has its own legacy actually, because of course we were having the one major legacy is British colonialism or British governance, right? British had control. Of course they came up with the devolution rules, but they wanted to control the whole nation, right? And therefore they had a centralized administrative system. They never devolved administrative powers, right? So they had centralized. So one legacy is there. In fact, even if you go by Government of India 1935 Act, there they talked about devolution, but for all practical purposes they had control of administrative and legislative powers.
And is that why mostly say a contentious issue whenever it goes to the judiciary, one has seen that the decision is, the verdict is usually more it's skewed towards the center.
So of course the Supreme Court is the final arbiter in this one. The original jurisdiction in the federal conflicts lies with the Supreme Court. So but Supreme Court has to operate within the framework of federal framework that is there, and to that, what I always call it as that there are lots of antinomies of federalism, like the governor's role, for instance, or president's rule, for instance, right? All India services, for instance. These are the antinomies of federal structure. You will not find this.
Which is not said in say other democracies. If you were to compare, the US, for instance, which is probably comes to a comparison rather than say Switzerland in terms of the diversity in terms of the width and breadth of a country. But there the states are very independent, and it's quite different from what we have here.
Of course there is this dual citizenship.
Yes.
And in India you have single citizenship. So that makes a lot of a difference. Now, interestingly, there are a lot of research and surveys that talk about that the allegiance to the state is declining, and the allegiance towards the center is increasing.
I see.
Yeah, and that is not a good sign for regional parties, because what we are seeing is the emergence of more ethnic democracy and therefore ethnic federalism. some of the political scientists have started talking about it as ethnic federalism. Now, ethnic federalism is where you see, which goes well along with the whole idea of Hindutva, right?
Yeah.
So that, and then a very strong leader is projected as the savior of ethnic federalism. So in that sense, it's not a good sign. But the fact that, there is always an effort by the regional parties, as Chinky was saying, that there's always an effort that the opposition must come together to fight against the ruling party.
Which is what we are seeing now. Like Mamata has claimed that make strong opposition.
That is what I'm going with. So, do you think the elections for these 5 states now is in fact showing signs of that?
Of course.
Right from, as you were saying, from Manipur to Goa.
Absolutely.
Going to Manipur.
There's this paradox with federalism. On one level it tries to centralize. But the more you centralize, is more regional aspirations would come up, because more you'll be trampling upon the aspirations of the region.
Right.
So centralization would trample on the aspirations of the region. The moment it tramples, the regional parties come up. So this paradox is there. Yeah. So this negotiation, accommodation, and consensus building process is interesting in the political process of federalism.
Yeah, and it's interesting that even in as recently as few years ago, that a new state like Telangana can be formed. I mean, with whatever the agitation that they sort of went through, and
Yeah, again, this is one of the antinomies of federalism, that center has overriding powers over creating a state. We have seen, we have seen how new states were created. Uttarakhand, So, unlike any other federalism, where US, for example, indestructible union of indestructible state, that's the principle with which federalism is based in US. India, that is not there, In fact, interestingly, Rahul Gandhi, when he said that Article 1 of the Constitution means India is the union of state.
Yeah, on Feb 2nd.
India, that is Bharat, which is the union of the state. This is what Constitution talks about, but in a sense that, this particular article also reflects some sort of centralization. Right, because the idea of federalism is that the units must come together, which means that the federating unit must come together to form federalism. Just like in US, the colonies came together, the 13 colonies came together, and they formed, they agreed, they came to a consensus. But in India, unfortunately, we did not have that representation. It was a constituent assembly, right, and a committee of the constituent assembly. They decided about this whole idea of how we need to have a federal country, but with strong unitary features.
Well, I have 2 questions on this.
Yes.
Firstly, is one is the delimitation question. Remember, we were talking about it, and we were having a joke that this will turn South India into a more fertile place because now with the 740 seats or whatever seats that they have made, and so that kind of,
and the argument that states that actually done well
at the moment,
progressive,
at the moment it's just a talk
my state
right
will
now.
do better.
At the moment it's just a talk now, but definitely it is it's a very strong. You see, we have nothing on the plate right now. Nothing concrete is there. It's just just the discussion, which of course is, for some it is scary, but for some it is a very good. They really like it. They really like it, right? That we will have the domination in terms of, because we are having more population.
No, because already there's so much North India, South India.
But I think this is the core question of asymmetric federalism. How we need to handle this question when we think in terms of structural asymmetry. There's Rajya Sabha is very weak. Council of States must represent the states, but hardly, it's representing the states. So that's very weak, right? And there's so much of dominance of certain states in the central legislation, which decides, for example, UP election is so important because nobody is bothering about Goa election, but everybody is focused on UP elections, because that's perhaps going to decide about the future political course, 2024 or something. It's going to decide about that. So, the experts or the specialists in federalism will have to focus on the issue of delimitation in solving some of the vexed asymmetrical federalism issues.
The second question was, when we were talking, we also talked about these 5 states, right? And you said that these 5 states have different histories. So if you could like sort of really talk about that, and how do they matter? See, for me, I think Goa is a very interesting state to look at in terms of like whatever you call it, like hope or whatever you call it. You know, see, the other trend we are seeing is a strong assertion of identity, you know, which we did not see in Goa before, because Goa has a very different history altogether. But they never. My question was, why didn't you have a strong regional party like, let's say, Shiv Sena or whatever? And then they said, so all of this put together, what do you think about the 5 states that are going for elections? Because remember that we talked about the conditions that were.
So you know, broadly, you know, the conditions. I think one will have to go into the States Reorganization Act to understand how these princely states and the British administered states and some of the, you know, scheduled areas, how they were brought into within the framework of federalism. Yes, the states, these 5 states, and more. By next year, I think another 4 or 5 states are going in for elections, right? So I think for the states, from the states' perspective, it's very important to understand that why these states are not focusing on the issues which are germane to that state. For instance, you know, in Goa, mining is very important.
Yeah.
Right. And nobody is talking about mining. It has slipped into the ethnic issues, identity issues. Even these small parties which have come up in Goa, they are talking about identity issues. So that's I think will be a problem when we discuss about fiscal federalism.
Yeah.
Because we need to understand that there are certain core problems of the state, which perhaps is also the problems of the country.
Yeah.
Which is like unemployment, inflation, you know, deepening economic crisis, for instance, right? So corruption in a massive way, you know, massive way corruption is cutting across all states. So this ethnic federalism, perhaps in the long run, would not help in achieving the goals of the federalism. Right. So goals of the federalism is very simple. You know, as we discussed that it has to think in terms of shared rule and self-rule. So the shared rule perhaps would have lots of problems. In fact, both the places it will have problems. So I think ethnic federalism is a recent turn which perhaps gives credence to authoritarian democracy.
And what are the dangers of that kind of democracy?
Yes. I think if you read this book, Modi's India, it's a fascinating book. I've just done a book review for one of the journals.
Okay.
And I read that, you know, it's a fascinating book. That how from conservative democracy, India has moved on to authoritarian democracy. So he's shown the journey. It's a fascinating journey. So it's very interesting.
No, it's quite interesting how even the constitution is being questioned by people, and that's why, like, we were students of political science, and you know, we always read like, okay, bicameral this thing, and then you have the federalism word.
But now I think, you know, because of another positive aspect of regional parties, that it internalizes the idea of federal processes.
Of course.
For people, right? So they recognize that yes, we can demand, you know, certain we can articulate our interest in a specific manner. We can demand certain things which are very specific to the state. So that has, you know, I mean, since I think this whole process started with 89 onwards, when the coalition politics
started much before.
So coalition has given has given those hopes, right? Otherwise, you know, I mean, imagine during Indira Gandhi period. I mean, of course, there was emergency. You know, I mean, 3 national emergencies you have seen, plus not just 3 national emergencies, but during, I think, Indira Gandhi regime, this center dismissing the state governments maximum.
Yes, yes, it's probably yeah, that's
Maximum.
true. Yeah.
So you can imagine that how federalism was not at all a key
Yeah.
question at that point of time.
Right.
So coalition, of course, has raised the hopes of regional parties.
Yeah.
And of course now they can maneuver, they can make tactical alliances, they can make
Yeah.
strategic alliances.
Yeah.
But those alliances, as I say that when you share power, right, what you do with power is more important than just sharing the power.
So thank you very much, Tanvir Ejaz, for coming over to our office and for this wonderful discussion, and thanks, Chikki.
I think-
Thank you so much for
Thank you
inviting
so
me.
much.
Thank you very
Thank you
much
so
for
much.
listening to this discussion.